Hi and welcome. This is the final video for the last week of our class in international marketing for you EMBA guys and men and women. We use guys inclusively, you know, us Yankees, we're prone to that. I should just say y'all, it's inclusive as well, right? Marketing futures, growth, precarity, and new goals. And what you're seeing there at the very beginning is a bit of Indian traffic. If you've ever been to an Indian city, it looks like that, except it's usually smoggier. It looks like a fairly clear day in some place like Chennai or maybe Mumbai. You can see the three-wheelers there, which are like taxi cabs, and get a little wet in the rain. They'll pull down the side curtains for you. Noisy things and traffic and increased automobility are a part of the developing world in many ways, just as they are here. I was talking to someone recently who lives in Eastern Virginia and has to occasionally drive to Washington, D.C., and he said that, you know, just traffic has added an hour to that commute compared to what it was 15 years ago. We're all experiencing the same kind of thing all over the world, but in developing economies without the infrastructure and without the history of building lots of roads, right? It's even more dramatic. You know, marketers have approached the world in a certain way, and we'll take a look at some other ways of approaching marketing given the realities of the current world with its interesting environmental challenges that are continuing to rear their unpleasantness around the world. And also, you know, this Indian image is relevant in another way, and that is that India is one of the places with the highest Islamic population in the world. We don't tend to think of India as a country with lots of Muslims, but in fact it is, of course. And so what I'll do is I'll walk through some of the basic facts of marketing to the Islamic world and the interesting cultural differences that are found there. Just kind of highlighting some major points, telling a few stories about that. So India is a good place to start in that way. We'll review a few things about it, the Islamic world, and there's a longer PowerPoint that's available online from this week's session that's right there on Canvas, and you can browse through that at your leisure. So let's take a look at reviewing that kind of sort of the top lines, the high points from that Islamic marketing business. Let me get the right slide going here. There we are. One of the interesting things here, we've got that Mecca Cola image, which is also present in that other slide deck on the right. That's an advertising piece from Mecca Cola. And I'll give you an example of some of the interesting things that happen around Islamic marketing. But to start with, lots of Muslims in the world, and we're talking about 23% of the world population, is included under that umbrella. These are statistics from the Pew research outfit. The second religion of the world by number of believers. Buddhism maybe third, and in the United States, the most rapidly growing religious group is the non-religious, of course, and that's generally the case in Europe as well, where things are a bit more secular. Just mentioning Mecca Cola, you can read that. I don't have to read it for you, but you know, Mecca Cola was founded by some folks based in France who were, I think the guy may have been Algerian or Moroccan, but he saw a business opportunity in Europe, not only in the Muslim community, but among others who maybe wanted something that was different from Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola or the big major brands. And he went first to Iran to see if he could get a licensing agreement. Does that sound familiar for international business? Kind of the first step. He tried to license a product. I think it was called what? Zuma, right? Yeah, Zamzam. That's it. Zamzam Cola. But he wasn't able to get the agreement, so he created his own brand, and he had some problems. The thing had to be relaunched a few years ago. And there was also some controversy around one of the value propositions of Mecca Cola. One of those was that a certain percentage of their profits would be donated to charitable causes, particularly the Palestinian cause, looking at schools in Palestine, which are underfunded and under the gun and in difficulty often. And it was reported that they weren't really making the contributions that they said they were going to make. So it was a bit of a kerfuffle for them, and they relaunched their brand a little bit later. They've recently had some problems as well that speaks to some of the variety of views about how you kind of wrap a marketing effort around some of the cultural differences that are engendered by the Muslim world. And you can read about that there. I don't have to read it to you. The United Arab Emirates said, you can't trademark this thing because we have a law that says you can't trademark anything with any kind of religious reference, no matter what the religion is. So Buddha footwear or I don't know, Jerusalem rice would probably come under some kind of scrutiny from the United Arab Emirates, as it was in the case of Mecca Cola. Despite their arguments to the contrary, they lost that case. I'm not sure where they are in the United Arab Emirates right now because they actually have their headquarters there now. They didn't used to, but they've moved the company there. Basic facts. Look at the small numbers in the Americas. 0.3% of the Muslim world in the United States. And of those, I've seen some numbers in the neighborhood of 30%, 26 to 30% are actually black Muslims. That is African Americans who maybe were not born into the faith but came to the faith later with the influence of Elijah Muhammad. If you've read the biography of Malcolm X, you know about the importance of that aspect of Islam in the American black community in the late 1960s and early 70s, and influences still continues. In my town, there is a local imam who is affiliated with that particular tradition. Sub-Saharan Africa, pretty big. We're talking Somalia. I'm sorry, it was the Sub-Saharan Africa. We're talking about Nigeria and the East African nations with high percentages of Muslims. Middle and East and North Africa comes in next. But look at the surprise here. Look at the Middle East compared to Asia Pacific. We tend to think when you're talking about the Muslim world that you're talking about Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and so on. But in fact, it's only 20% of the Muslim population worldwide. The largest group is in the Asia Pacific region. We're talking about the country we so often ignore, which is Indonesia and also Malaysia, with very, very large Muslim populations. And by the way, those tend to be rather more secular Muslims. A lot of folks will identify as Christian or Muslim and then don't, you go to church on Easter and Christmas, You may want to make a Hajj someday, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca that every believing Muslim should make if possible, as a way of participating and practicing that religion. But, not everybody gets there. Not everybody fasts during Ramadan, but everybody kind of likes the party afterwards. I don't know if you guys had a chance to check in with some of your Muslim colleagues and get some of those after daylight snacks that are so delightful during Ramadan, or that wonderful meal after Ramadan when people are able to sit down and cook. Because, no cooking during Ramadan. You're not supposed to don't cook during the daytime, right? I'm not sure what the rule is for cooking in the evening, but certainly Ramadan is a special time. And not everybody is, full on participating. But look at the numbers here, 61% in Asia Pacific. That's important for marketers to understand. And there again, just another regional breakdown of what's there. Here's the numbers. Look at Nigeria compared to Iran, or compared to Algeria, Turkey, Morocco, down at the bottom. Percentage of Muslims in the population. Although you're looking at 99% in a place like Morocco, Nigeria, 48%. India, 14%, but it's 14% of a big population. That puts them at the #2 Muslim country in the world. We don't usually think of it that way, but that's the way that landscape plays out. Interesting also to note that the median age really varies. Look at North America. Look at the median age in the United States. Regional median age, 37. A Muslim median age in the region, right? 26. In other words, to be a Muslim in the United States means that you're younger than the average person. That we're talking about the mean, the average. There's no such person who fits it exactly, but in terms of statistical norms and statistical means, that's where things play out. Look at Sub-Saharan Africa, on the other hand. Muslim median age versus regional median age. Very young. These are countries with high populations at the younger end of the population curve. And look at Europe, 40 for an average age and 32 for the Muslim median age. Across the board, Muslims are generally younger. You tend to have somewhat larger families. That's particularly true in Europe. It's also true in the United States. One thing to know, and I don't have a slide about it, is that in the United States, Muslims are generally solidly middle class or upper middle class, folks who have the wherewithal, those 60% of Muslims roughly in the United States who are immigrants, often second generation. Sometimes first generation, they tend to have enough money to be able to make that move. So you have people who move here with resources and who are sort of pre-adapted in some ways to open small businesses or to operate in business or to find themselves being employed as economists or, technical professionals of various kinds tend to be actually better educated than the United States population as a whole, according to what I have been told by our Islamic marketing specialist here in the United States. So there are some real differences across geographies about the Muslim population that marketers care about. We hear about Sunni and Shia, two different types of beliefs, just as there are Catholics and Protestants, or just as there is the Mahayana tradition in Buddhism, or the tradition that is very different that you'll find in places like Myanmar or Cambodia. And then the Tibetan tradition, also different in the Buddhist side, but very different perspectives in different groups that come from very ancient historical schisms in the religion. It's young, it's global, it's emerging countries, it's a growing middle class, it's heterogeneous. And by how heterogeneous? Well, not just one or two languages, but hundreds of languages present in every country in the world. That includes Latin America, it includes the Caribbean, every place. There is, and this is important, there is no central religious authority. There's no Pope of the Muslims. You may have some religious authorities within particular sects, just as there are in the United States. There is a Pope of the Presbyterians. They jokingly call it that. It's the chief presbyter, if you're any presbys in the room. And just as the Anglican Communion has a presiding bishop, Archbishop of Canterbury, and just as the United States Episcopalians have an archbishop, if you're a Baptist, they don't go for that, right? Baptists are a little bit different. I think they have a president or some kind of presiding officer over their convention. That's about it. So, actually Baptists and the Islamic world have an awful lot in common, because they do not have a central religious authority. It's kind of fun to frame it that way. Two main groups, of course, Sunni and Shia. 4 law schools associated only with Sunnism, but they have different interpretations of the kinds of thinking about law that are apparent in the Islamic world. And we think of the Sharia as the kit of laws that explain to you how to be a religious person, how to be a good person living in the world. And that includes things like you should be kind to others, and you should donate, and you should, get this, not charge interest on loaned money. In fact, you shouldn't loan at all, and the business about charging interest is not to be done. That is perhaps the most interesting and dramatic difference in doing business in the Islamic world. In many places, although banks are used, as we've said, that lots of folks in the Islamic, within that circle, right, are fairly secular, right, are going to go ahead and use banks. But in some places in the Islamic world, particularly in the Arab countries, banking has to be structured in such a way that interest is not there. How do you do a bank without interest? I'm no expert. We can talk briefly about how that's done, but it does raise some interesting challenges. Here's the main Muslim denominations that you'll see around the world. And you notice it's more than 1 or 2 or 3. The Wahhabi folks in Saudi Arabia, get a lot of press, fairly conservative in their approach. You can go to other places like in Turkey, where things are much more open, tend to be more secular, right? And there are lots of non-denominational Muslims who are Muslim in tradition and in culture and in food and in history, but maybe not practicing. Really an awful lot of variety here, and sometimes some friction among and between groups, but not always. And it's a very diverse picture. You could spend your life studying what's going on here. Before we go on to precarious futures, let me go back to this just for a moment and mention something about Islamic finance. Islamic finance is a field of study in itself. I was talking to a Korean business executive who works for the Korean Power Company while I was in Korea. And we brought up this issue because they do business in the United Arab Emirates. And he said that, at one point we had to buy some equipment. And generally, when you buy a big piece of equipment, or when your customer wishes to buy a big piece of equipment, they go get banking support, right? And the bank's going to make you a loan, and you're going to pay interest on the loan. Well, in the Islamic world, if you go to an Islamic bank, that's not what happens. In fact, what happens is they arrange a lease agreement or some kind of lease purchase, so that at the end of the day, the income is still flowing to the bank. Now, credit cards also are interesting. And that's not managed by charging interest, but by charging fees for service. So you see, there are kind of ways to kind of tweak the cultural system to allow the presence of these things. Just as in the case of Coca-Cola, let me go back to that for a second. Coca-Cola takes the idea from the Sharia, right? We think of Sharia as being a law that's going to be imposed on everybody. And listen, anybody who's a Talmudic scholar, anybody who's gone to a Jewish school like I did for a while, I went to Brandeis for a while, recognizes that there is Talmudic law and there are rules by which Jewish people are supposed to live. Presbyterian Church has that too. They've got a code of laws, and they've got a court. An ecclesiastical court is a part of many religions in the Western tradition and Christianity. So let's don't be confused about what Sharia means. It means a variety of things. You know, if you're some crazy wacko who thinks they're going to restore the caliphate, then you're going to call Sharia law in to reinforce some of your craziness, just as other people like to take little bits and pieces and cherry pick from an ideology to make it look okay and sanitary and approved. So, you know, it's nothing new there. So let's be careful about how we talk about the Sharia. And I should preface that by, and I should really mention, or postscript, is that I'm not an expert on all of these things, but I have good friends who are, and they've informed me about some of those issues. All right, so if you want to know a little bit more about some of the varieties of issues facing Islamic marketing, you can look at the longer spreadsheet there, which includes a lot of interesting things. You know, there are issues about fashion and how fashion works. Modest clothing is an important thing for women. And, you know, there are fashion magazines for women. There are vacation companies that provide special services that when you go to the hotel, you know, you're going to find halal food, right? And the whole issue about halal, which means approved under Sharia, that is approved and okay, not by any central authority. You can imagine what the problems are when somebody pushes out a thing and says, oh, it's halal. Somebody says, nah, no, it's not, because it was transported in a truck that also handled non-halal things. Sounds a lot like keeping kosher, doesn't it? You know, don't mix the dairy and the meat on the same plate. Don't ask for mayo on your pastrami sandwich in the Jewish deli in New York, because it's like not kosher, right? It's the opposite of kosher, which in the Islamic world is called haram, forbidden. So there's a lot to know about all this stuff, and a lot of very interesting things going on as we see major clothing designers in the West producing items for consumption in places like Oman and the you know, and in Dubai, where you see women carrying Fendi bags and wearing Prada shoes and wearing beautiful abaya that may be designer abayas, right? Or designer hijabs, right? The head covering. So, you know, business adapts itself to these circumstances, just as Islamic ideologies and ideas about what's good and what's bad have adapted themselves over time, as all religious and cultural traditions do. More to be said about that, of course. We see more of that these days because, you know, we're in a globalized place where things move around a lot. And in addition to being in a globalized place, we are a planet that is becoming very much aware of the fact that we have finite resources. Ever since the Apollo spacecraft took pictures of, you know, the sun rising over the moon, we have a very clear understanding that we exist on a little blue ball floating around in space in a very flat, fragile planet. I remember as a kid looking at maps and thinking, wow, if I was an airplane, I should be able to see all of these states at once. And you realize how thin the layer of air is around the planet, relatively. You realize what a fragile resource our air is. And if you are someone who studies the environment, if somebody who is involved in farming or agriculture, you know the delicate balance that has to be achieved in order to grow crops and in order for things to sustainably exist on this planet. Well, now we're realizing that sea level rise is a reality. Entire countries are about to disappear, and very large populations of people, not only overseas but also in the United States, are very much at risk of sudden, immediate refugee status, as they have to leave if sea levels continue to rise, and so on. You know, we don't have to belabor that point. But all of those challenges present some really interesting issues for business. And a recent article in The Guardian was talking about the fact that, you know, sustainable driving and getting rid of fossil fuel is not going to be enough, because a very high percentage of greenhouse gases come from agriculture. And, you know, the global inequality is also a part of what happens along with our current economic model. And the Guardian article was arguing for maybe a different way to conceive of economic health, a completely different way of looking at it, rather than saying, well, you know, growth is going to be the solution. We'll lift people out of poverty by increasing gross domestic product. Well, economists have not been asleep at the wheel in this issue. These are not new questions for a lot of economists, although most folks do use gross domestic product, and most international marketers use GDP or some measure of overall economic health that is based on a monetary index of some kind, capital flows in or how much per capita and so on, that those are used as measures of economic health. And they're also used as policy goals. And they're also very much used in business to measure the success of a CEO. How much have you grown the company? Have our profits gone up? You don't want them going down. That wouldn't be a good thing for your investors or for your employees either. So, economists play around with what other measures might be used to do that. We'll talk about a little of that in a second. There's an additional issue, and if we step back and take the really wider view, you might do what Kath Wesson has done when she looked at that lovely new car smell, or looked at the amount of packaging that goes onto a snack when she's sitting in Venice, was one of the examples. The curious problem with business efforts to address sustainability in business, which is usually called CSR, right? Corporate social responsibility or sustainability. Kind of two different buckets, but we can lump them together for our purposes here. Kath Weston is an anthropologist who had been doing some work in India, and she starts this article, which you can read if you want to. I'll post this thing online for you. It's an interesting one. And I find it a very provocative, in many ways a difficult article to read, because it's really talking about a very bleak future, the kind of future that's faced by people who live under the brand new bridge of the brand new highway in Delhi, which is in fact the majority of people in the world don't have the resources to buy a car. So, we're talking often, we think that poor people are a minority in the world. In fact, their numbers are decreasing. People have more resources today than before, and we've talked about that, and you've seen that in some of the videos. But certainly in a lot of developing economies, poverty is the order of the day, and it's especially grinding in a place like India. And so it came to her attention that, the Nano, which is a fairly famous example of Tata Motors trying to address the needs of lower income people, or the desire of lower income people to have a four-wheeled vehicle in which to ride around and take their families. A lot of folks you'll see in India riding 3 or 4 to a motorcycle. You'll see an entire family along with groceries. That's a little bit scary and precarious for people. But, her big question is this: do sustainability efforts like those that are pushed and continue to be pushed by both shareholders, stakeholders, and some corporate CEOs. Even Walmart, has a big green initiative and has been fairly successful in some aspects in its efforts there. Do they continue to rely on the same kind of heavy resource extraction that got the world into this trouble in the first place, right? That's essentially the question that was being asked up here by the Guardian economist, or at least economic journalists, that maybe we need some other ways of modeling success, right? It's not that it's a giant radical question either, in fact. But if you look at the reality of the difficulties faced with planetary environmental degradation, we can recognize the fact that this is not anything new. First of all, scholarly attention to this. I was aware of this as a young person in undergraduate school, taking a class from an archaeologist who had studied tree ring data and was talking to us about what was then called the greenhouse effect. And he said, you can see in tree rings in the Pacific Northwest when the Industrial Revolution begins. At least it correlates with that. We've seen the correlation around the world in tree ring data, that climate change and changes in the nature of the atmosphere were evident there. And there was enough climate modeling at the time to raise some eyebrows, and people began asking some very tough questions about where we were headed with our continued reliance on extracting carbon from the ground that had in the past been trapped pre-Pleistocene. So, although you may not be interested in extinction might be interested in us. Now, there's a dark moment. Well, maybe that's a good theme for this week. We just heard some convention speeches that were also, wow, hide the children. The world's going to heck in a handbasket. And I hate to go down that road in the environmental way, but this is what Kath Weston is doing, and she does it in a very interesting way, suggesting that maybe some of the solutions that sustainability efforts globally, and that includes international marketing, are implicated. That sometimes we tend to fall back on the same model, right? And you'll hear people talking in product development and in international marketing over and over and over again, warning you away from thinking with the sort of cultural assumptions that you bring to the table without examining them carefully, right? The VOCs, the new car smell. Well, let's just say that that's a good thing. Well, let's even get a spray bottle. We can make our car smell like that. It became desired and desirable when in fact it's carcinogenic. You don't want to smell that stuff. The in Delhi, India, the nano, the the key to the happiness, right? If all the nano target consumers had nanos, could anyone move or breathe in India? That's the question that Kath Weston asks. What's the responsibility of marketers there? And, it's a long article, and she tells a very personal story of her coming to an awareness of a set of questions about how to address human problems that comes from a very different and troubling place, one in which a shared sense of precarity underlies a lot of the decisions people are making. And that rather than examining carefully where that precarity or difficulty is coming from, you tend to fall back on the sort of scientific and technical or traditional marketing approaches and say, well, we can just use our marketing tools to market sustainability to make more cars, but make them smaller and make them better. And is that really going to solve the problem? That's the question that both Kath Weston is asking and this most recent article in The Guardian is asking. And it's one I want international marketers to think about. Now, I know your boss is not going to ask you to come up with a sustainability plan to address our reliance on old economic models, right? I'm not suggesting global revolution or silly, dumb Marxism that, we know the results of central planned economies. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about let's question those assumptions more deeply than we have. And I think that's where Kath is going. So I display for your perusal on this, this page the way she frames up the very end, that we have affective attachments and with them capital-intensive regimes of production designed to elicit those affective attachments, you could say desires. And our continued engagement with those may actually discourage what she says, a meaningful reorganization of a system, and I would say a system of thinking for those of us in marketing that represents immense short-term profitability for some, but presents dangers for others. And she ends it without finishing the sentence, as you see. We're all likely to be wrapped up in our projects and plans for sustainability and immersed in what we believe to be another interlude on the way to pleasure or progress or the very next thing, when suddenly it's fun to hold the silence for an uncomfortably long time. I think this is a difficult article, and I think there's lots of ways to critique it. But I also think it opens up a new way of thinking about things. But she ain't the only one to do this. Now, if you back up to the folks who are playing around with the sustainability idea, they are not afraid to ask some really tough questions about the ways in which we approach marketing today and ask these kinds of questions. When futures can't be imagined, that's really Kath's, the last one. What to do with consumer needs and wants, what do people need in the face of kind of precarity would be what, practically, what do you do with this critique? What do you do with this concern about resource depletion, right? Well, human beings are pretty smart, and I like to reflect on the fact that we've managed to put people in places like outer space, and entire cultures have survived in places like the Arctic, which used to be really cold all the time, and is now pretty cold part of the time. I won't go into the sidebar about how much the Arctic has changed, but I will say that a number of people have done an awful lot of really interesting, intensive, on-the-ground research with people who are hunters in the Arctic who are able to tell you about the dramatic changes they've seen, not only in wildlife, but even in the way the sun comes up in the morning, because as the atmosphere has changed, the spherical nature of the atmosphere reflects light in a certain way that makes the sun actually come up in a different place. Slight, but if you're an outdoor person who's a hunter and is aware of, over this little rise is where the sun comes up on this day, and it's not doing that the way it did 30 years ago, you've got a heightened level of concern if you're out in that environment. So what do you do about that as a marketer, right? Do we continue down this road that we've been in before, right, or not? Well, here's a guy named Philip Kotler. He's a very well-respected professor of international marketing. And here on the left are our old assumptions. And of course, he's setting up a straw man. I'm not sure if everyone ever really believed all of this, but that's what he's got to set out. And then on the right-hand side, maybe a different way of thinking about it. And I think the different way is already presaged by a lot of the experiences of international marketers around the world. They've run into the issue that wants are culturally influenced. They aren't found in nature. We aren't compelled to only deal with the wants we find in the world, that in fact the wants are created, right? Listerine didn't exist as a mouthwash. Nobody needs mouthwash. It's kind of pleasant. I like it once in a while myself. And my dentist says, yeah, it can kind of help. But remember, things like Listerine are maybe a good example. Listerine was the result of the research work of a surgeon named Jacob Lister, who invented Listerine as a surgical antiseptic, as antiseptic surgery was just getting started. We can douse the wound once we made our incision with Listerine with this product. It's going to be an antiseptic. Well, they invented halitosis, right? They were trying to find new uses for the product. If you do interviews about how people use mouthwash, you talk to some really senior people, they'll say, oh yeah, I used to use it on my hair. You go, what? Well, it turns out that Listerine was actually marketed as a hair tonic, good for the scalp in the late 50s and early 1960s. And some folks remember that and still use it. It's kind of odd to think about. Don't know if the minty fresh version is the best to use, but certainly that's an option. It is an example, right, of needs being sort of invented. Deodorant didn't exist as a product category until recently, and it still doesn't exist in China for biological reasons. Folks don't need it to the same extent that other folks do, and there is a genetic marker for that. But the point is, resources are not finite. We know that. Carrying capacity for waste is not infinite. It's finite. And interestingly, well known to Buddhists, one would think, not that there aren't some Buddhists driving BMWs around who also are in charge of temples in Myanmar and elsewhere, quality of life and happiness do not necessarily increase with more consumption. That assumption is already always culturally biased, right? Now, one of the things Kotler doesn't talk about is that, our measures of economic growth as a measure of business and national success may be part of the problem here. Be aware of there are and have been alternatives to looking at economic growth as a measure of national well-being. We use GDP as sort of a policy tool or as a target, right? We're going to improve people's well-being by increasing the gross domestic product. But as far back as the late 1980s, economists, some economists, not all, but a handful, were looking at other kinds of measures, right? GDP, is not the only way to measure the well-being of an economy. You can also measure things like happiness, right? It's kind of famous that the country of Nepal uses that as a measure with which to set policy. You might argue, well, it's because they don't have any money economy that's worth anything. Well, in fact, there's a middle class in Nepal. But the government has decided, and it's, of course, we've got a strong religious component in that nation state. To the north of India, they've decided they want to look at the happiness index. They created one. I don't know if they borrowed it or created it, in fact, but you can look back in 1989 when David Cobb and his colleagues created a sustainable economic welfare index. There are things called the genuine progress indicator, the happiness index, and others. But there are other arguments from other economists that say, look, these are measuring different things. It's the question about what you choose to measure the economic or other kinds of well-being in a community. And I think the net of net here is that just looking at sales numbers is not maybe the only way to look at marketing success, that there are other measures of success to marketing. And I think most marketing planners at some level know that, right? It's not just gross sales, maybe it's market share, or maybe it's how satisfied you are, or maybe it's, if you're a cell phone company, how you reduce your churn, right? How much less turnover you get, how much loyalty you build. Or maybe your sort of brand halo increases and the public perception of the value of your brand increases, which could actually affect your stock price too, if you think about it. Kotler's views about futures of marketing, I think, are really worth reflecting on. Right now, he says, and this is true, CEO compensation is tied to growth, not sustainability. We don't reward executives for that. We've seen an absolute explosion in CEO compensation as we've seen so many businesses become fiscalized and focusing on their numbers and their investments and how they manage money rather than how they actually manage products. That's not true of every company, certainly, but it has been a trend. And he's suggesting that maybe it's time to reconsider that if we're going to get serious about sustainability. And he does an interesting thing. He takes the old 4 Ps, product, price, place. Oops, let's fix that line here. That's the sort of thing spell checkers never catch. Place and promotion. Said, well, if you're thinking product, we're going to think about packaging, disposal, and energy use across the board for our products. That would be kind of a shift, right? Instead of just looking at a product market fit, looking at the fit between customer needs and your customer segments and your value proposition, let's take a look at the actual use of the product. or what I think I may have mentioned before, which is look at the product itinerary, look at what happens before, during, and after purchase. Where does it go? How does it use? What are the implications of that for sustainability? When you look at price, instead of just looking at price elasticities, right? There's a economic term that I only barely understand, not being an economist. Instead of just looking at, the effect of increasing or decreasing price on things, take a look at how willing consumers are to pay for more green. And you may want to consider the price of externalities, and there are other ways to do that, right? Looking at the fact that, okay, you're paying this much, but you're not bearing the cost of disposal. That's the city waste dump and the trash collector, and on and on, right? You think about the price of on the cost to the quality of the air in producing a product, right? So you think about the entire chain of production around a product. It's a very different way of thinking about price. Place is another one, and that's where you can really think a bit more about production and distribution. Are we creating a bigger carbon footprint? Lots of companies are playing around with this UPS, trying to get a low pollution fleet of vehicles out there. A number of companies with lots of delivery vehicles are looking at that. Lots of trucking companies, certainly Walmart's looked at that and tried to make a difference there. But in planning for product manufacturing and distribution, where you site your factory, is it close to your market? And do people have to drive to the store to do it? Are we supporting public policies that encourage people to use public transportation, for example? I mean, you could say that in LA and people just roll their eyes. And they roll their eyes in Houston because they don't really have public transportation. And certainly that's true in most mid-tier cities in the United States. But that's not true. As you recognize, in a place like Germany, it's taken for granted that there's going to be a good public transportation system. What are the impacts of having that on the carbon footprint of the product that you expect to have people come look for and take home, right? Is that usually a part of our thinking in marketing? Well, Kotler's suggesting that it should be. And, you can think about the impacts of online selling as reducing consumer travel as well. Amazon, right, is playing into this kind of perspective. And then promotion, well, I don't know. I think more could be said here, but he says, well, we used to use a lot of paper and flyers, and that's printing, and they're heavy, and they're hard to move. And if you do it on the internet, maybe it's a lower cost issue. Well, there are a lot of externalities involved in the internet too. We're using an awful lot of energy to keep all these servers going. And that's why there are lots of fans in those server rooms, because it's a lot of energy and a lot of heat being generated. That's why Apple is investing heavily in alternative energy sources. It's to operate all those servers. It takes a lot of juice to keep the internet running. It's not a green technology all by itself. And there are also long-range problems with doing that. If you look at Elon Musk's recent announcement that he's trying to do what everyone said he was going to do eventually, and that is link his battery technology to household power generation, small-scale solar rooftop, and medium-scale distribution that would be of interest to utilities. That requires something that you have to dig out of the ground. That's a resource that's in short supply, and that's lithium. And when the detritus hits the rotary oscillator on that business model, we're going to see places like Chile and Bolivia become very important, because they're sitting on an awful lot of lithium in those salares, in those flat saline seasonal lakes in the Andes, right? But for promotion generally, all of that aside, the issue is that you can think through these 4 Ps and look at them from a sustainability perspective, and you start asking very different questions. That's a healthy thing for marketers to do, and something marketers need to do. The other piece that Kotler talks about is really interesting. There's really 2 pieces to it. One is demarketing, and the other one is social marketing. Demarketing is the practice of demand reduction, following those same 4 Ps, and it's been done before. Think about California. The target for Los Angeles, I believe, was to reduce water use somewhere around 16%. I need to review those figures, but it was somewhere in that neighborhood. Southern Californians reduced their water consumption on average considerably more than that, like 50% more, like 20, 21, 22%. Now, whether or not they'll maintain that, now that the water emergency has been taken off the table by Governor Brown, last I heard. But the point is that, there was an enormous marketing effort and also cash put into incent people to use less water. You know, so much of the water that we process and distribute for human consumption is actually put on people's front lawns in California. In an environment that's semi-desert, does it really make sense to have your front lawn look like the north of England? Yeah, well, probably not, although it does look nice and feels good on your bare feet. So people were actually given a cash incentive to turn their lawns into something that would be a low water garden, and it worked super well. And it went along with an awful lot of marketing and communication about the importance of water conservation in California. The other piece, of course, is the rise of social marketing. And here, you know, one of the images that was in one of the previous PowerPoints that I really didn't talk about too much was a woman talking about some things in her agricultural job on her small farm, and some changes and new technologies that made it possible for her to make enough money to do a better job feeding her family and do some new things. The efforts that work best for marketers in that department, talking about developing rural or lower income communities, use the same techniques that marketing uses overall, with a real strong emphasis on the importance of the business model. That is, looking carefully at creating a market, not just working within it. So that a foot-operated water pump, which is very effective in areas with low water tables where farmers need to get the water out of the ground in an environment in which a lot of the rain comes at one part of the year and then it's super dry the rest of the year, like in Bangladesh or in parts of India, in these big littoral areas with large rivers and a big flat plain, and agriculture is really tough for small holders unless they've got a diesel pump. But you can use a foot-operated pump, and rather than just selling it from a manufacturer in Britain or Delhi, you can have your local blacksmith build these things. You can get a local person to help you install and maintain them. You can have local shopkeepers sell the small nylon inserts that make the pumps operate. Then you can have your kids have fun, you know, working the pump, and you can work the pump, and it's enough. It generates enough water for small and medium-sized plots of land to be irrigated. And you really see the results in farmer incomes who are able to get 2 or 3 crops where they used to get just 1 before. The success relies on thinking about not only imposing a particular product or a solution, but thinking about how to create an entire ecology, an entire market around those, right? So it's using that sort of business model canvas sort of holistic thinking to apply the skills of marketers to solve real problems for real people on the ground that deal with the issues that Kath Weston and others are talking about. When they talk about inequality in the world, marketers can have a role in resolving that. Now, it's up to you guys to think how that might fit or might not fit in your own international efforts. But certainly it's the case that you may market only to one kind of person today, but is that going to be true tomorrow? You know, if you think about expanding into developing markets, the insights that are provoked by tough thinkers like Kath Weston, it's really a challenging article, or folks like Philip Kotler, I think are going to be useful for us once you've absorbed this notion that, you know, culture is a relational thing, that it's not something that's given in paper and that you're going to expect all Germans to be alike. It's not going to be like that. Once you've got the idea that moving from one market into another means taking the time to understand and not getting in a hurry like Americans always do, to understand the local networks of suppliers and make decent relationships with them in ways that are culturally appropriate, which varies over time and varies from place to place. Really, it's a matter of listening carefully to other people and doing what one of your colleagues, I think, isn't that awful? I'm sorry. What one of your colleagues mentioned in the very first couple of days of the class last year, and that is that although there's all of these differences around the world, human beings, at the end of the day, have a lot more in common than we have different, right? There are a lot more similarities than there are differences in the world and the ways in which we interact and care about one another and want to take care of our families. And by the way, I'd really like a nice little treat to eat right now, and I think I'm going to go get one. It's a pretty human thing. So with that in mind, I want to thank you guys for your patience this week, as we have had some technical difficulties with GoToMeeting. I hope the readings have been enjoyable, and I've been enjoying reading your book reviews and looking at your reports. We got some great photographs. I'll try and figure out a way that you guys can see one another's work on Canvas. I'll do that over the weekend. If you have questions for me, I am going to do a Make Good office hours next week. I'm going to get with Dustin so we can do that. Spent about an hour on the phone today maybe a little more than that, back and forth with Missouri Tech Assistants trying to get GoToMeeting work for me, but I've decided, look, let's do the video today, so that's it. So I look forward to seeing any of you who are available next Tuesday for a final office hours. We can talk about some of these issues if you like. Just see how things are going, and have a great weekend. Thanks a lot, you guys.